The film begins with a man coming into a restaurant that isn't too busy. The man's name is Frank. Then the waitress brings coffee and offers a menu. But Frank didn't answer. But we also learn that Frank's sense of hearing is so acute that he can hear whispers or faint sounds from a distance. Frank then stands up and goes into the kitchen, locks the door from the inside, and then attacks a chef.
Do I look crazy to you?
We are then taken to the events of Frank's past when he was still a successful lawyer and was always busy with his work, even he was very difficult to make time for his family.
2 words a day. Words were my weapon of choice.
Together with his wife named Sue and his daughter named Olivia, Frank lived in a very luxurious house. One day, Olivia called Frank because she had promised to watch his performance at a school event.
You'll be here?
I promise.
But in the end Olivia had to endure disappointment, because when she checked the stands before the show started, she only saw her mother there. Actually, Frank had tried to arrive on time, but he was stuck with his work. After his work was done, he rushed to the venue, but unfortunately he was late. The show was already over. Unable to do anything, Frank went home, but it turned out that Sue and Olivia hadn't returned yet. Frank could only wait anxiously as the day wore on. His worries grew when the police came to his house. The cop informs him that Sue and Olivia have died, and now he asks Frank to come with him to the train yard, where the bodies of Sue and Olivia are dumped by the killer in a pit. As soon as he saw them, Frank rushed over as if he wanted to hug them, but the police stopped him.
That's my
Sue and Olivia's funeral was solemn. Many guests came, one of whom is Frank's father-in-law, Chuck. Chuck had always disliked Frank, and his hatred only grew after the tragic deaths of Sue and Olivia. Chuck blames Frank and his greed for Sue and Olivia's death. That's because as a lawyer, Frank was only willing to defend important and rich people, regardless of whether the person he was defending was guilty or not. Chuck then ended their conversation by saying that he didn't want to hear Frank say another word to him.
Never want to hear your voice again.
After the funeral, Frank was always haunted by guilt. He spent his time sitting in Olivia's room and reading Olivia's notes. However, one day, Frank goes to the police station to inquire about the case of the deaths of Sue and Olivia. He met with Lustiger, the detective who handled the case. Lustiger explained that based on the investigation results at the crime scene, his team found golden threads. But the discovery was not enough to be used as real evidence.
Found these tiny gold fibers.
Gold fibers? You guys never found my wife's purse.
We are exhausting all leads.
I'll try harder. God damn it.
Furious over the slow performance of the police, Frank could only express his sorrow by getting drunk. One evening, after drinking glasses of alcohol, he went to a bar and went downstairs, where he accidentally saw a wild fight with a large crowd. Frank, who is drunk, deliberately provokes one of the fighters into beating him. Surprisingly, the next day Frank took part as one of the fighters. He did it as an outlet for his failure to protect Sue and Olivia. But Frank, who has no martial arts skills, can be easily defeated by other fighters. He always suffered defeat and came home with a bruised face, until one day, he was beaten by one of the fighters until he was seriously injured. Luckily, he was saved by a policeman named Hank Strode. He was the cop who had brought Frank to the train yard. While chatting in a cafe, Strode admitted that he also participated in the illegal fight just to relieve stress. He didn't expect to see Frank become a fighter there. Furthermore, Strode said that the investigation was temporarily suspended.
It's been reprioritized from active to cold. I thought you knew.
Frank exploded when he heard the news. He certainly couldn't accept it, but he couldn't do anything about it. In the middle of the night, a girl approaches Frank on his way home. The girl peddled herself to Frank, but seeing that she was still too young, Frank turned her down. Not long after, a man came to pick up the girl. Not wanting the girl to fall into child prostitution, Frank rebukes the man. The man responded to Frank's rebuke by beating him until he bled. Frank was able to counterattack the man, but the girl suddenly stabbed Frank in the left thigh, causing him to lose his balance and fall against the window of a bookstore.
I probably would have heard it.
Luckily, he fell into a pile of bookshelves, so he could use a book to stop the bleeding on his stab wound. He staggered out of the shop to hide from the police. In hiding, Frank reads the book that was used to cover his wound. It was a book about Marcus Aurelius' meditations. Inadvertently, he read the part of the book about the punishment of crimes for those who confessed. Furthermore, every day, Frank continued to read the book, which provided a deep motivation for Frank to study martial arts. Subsequently, he began to train himself vigorously in several martial arts, from karate to boxing. At the beginning of his training, Frank was always easily overpowered by his coaches. However, his skills continued to improve until he was finally able to beat his karate coach during a fighting practice session. His boxing practice also shows satisfactory progress. His punches are getting harder. One day, Frank drew a line on the mouth of a man on the cover of a book he was reading, indicating that from that moment on he vowed not to say a word until he could take revenge on the killers of his wife and daughter.
I took my own vow not to be broken until I avenged my wife and daughter's murders.
Surprisingly, after that, Frank's hearing was sharper than usual, to the point where he could hear even the smallest sound.
My sense of hearing had drastically improved. Good things do happen when you shut the fuck up for a minute or two.
The next day, Frank visits the place where the bodies of Sue and Olivia were dumped by the killer. There, he found a container filled with complete furniture, just like a house. The container has a hole overlooking the place where the bodies of Sue and Olivia were found. Unable to find any clues, Frank returned to his car, which was parked near an overpass. When he got there, he saw 4 thugs trying to gouge his car. The thugs even forced Frank to give up his car keys. Frank, who had sworn not to speak, was silent as the thugs threatened him. Then one of the thugs ordered his dog to attack Frank. But miraculously, the dog just barked, as if he was hesitant to attack Frank. But when Frank glared at the dog immediately ran away. A fight ensues in which the 4 thugs attack Frank simultaneously. Frank then grabbed one of the thugs and showed him a picture of Sue and Olivia. The thug unfortunately knew nothing about the murder case, so Frank let him go. But just as Frank was about to get into his car, the thug shot him. With his injured body, Frank was still able to beat the thug. Before long, the dog that had run away came back and approached Frank after seeing that he was injured. At the same time, the 4 thugs hurried away, unaware that Frank had fallen unconscious beside his car. When he woke up, Frank was in a house occupied by a nurse named Alma. After introducing herself, Alma informed Frank of his condition when she found him at the train yard. Frank didn't respond and refusing to speak. Frank even left without saying thank you, even though Alma intended to treat his wound. Outside Alma's house, the dog was waiting for him. The dog followed Frank wherever he walked. Seeing this, Frank decided to take the dog to his house. Every day, Frank continues to collect evidence to uncover the killers of Sue and Olivia, from newspaper clippings to photographs related to the murder case. One afternoon, Alma came to return Frank's wallet that he left at her house. Frank invited Alma in. Unexpectedly, Alma found out the reason Frank refused to speak. Then, Frank showed Alma the photo of Sue and Olivia, as well as the evidence he had gathered. Thanks to Alma's help, Frank was able to identify the occupants of the container near the crime scene. The occupant of the container, according to Alma, works in a restaurant. Then Frank visits the restaurant to meet the container's occupant, a cook nicknamed Mr. Shivers. This scene is shown at the beginning of the film where Frank comes to interrogate Mr. Shivers. Frank beats Mr. Shivers to a pulp before showing a picture of Sue and Olivia. Shivers finally confessed that he saw their murder, but he couldn't see the killer's face clearly. Shivers could only confirm that the culprit was wearing a police uniform, and he left the crime scene in a car. Mr. Shivers himself admitted that he only took money from the wallet that was left in Sue's car.
I'm sorry.
To prove Mr. Shivers' words, Frank returns to inspect the crime scene. However, this time, he came with his new dog, which proved to be very useful. The dog found Sue's purse in the manhole. Frank then visits the police station, where he sneaks into Lustiger's room and opens the data on his computer. Frank wants to know who the police were on duty when Sue and Olivia died. Surprisingly, he saw Strode's name. Frank had a hard time believing what he had found. He doubts that Strode killed his wife. So, to find out his motives, Frank followed Strode wherever he went for 7 days and 7 nights.
My demons were chasing me, night after night, day after day, so I kept watching. A sign, or maybe a mistake.
One day, as Frank follows Strode to his house, he sees Strode leaving his house. Frank sneaks into the house looking for evidence. In the living room, he saw a photo of Strode with his little daughter. Then when he went to the wardrobe, he found one of Strode's police uniforms which had one of the gold threads loose from an embroidered sleeve badge. The gold thread reminded Frank of the evidence Lustiger had found some time ago. Curious, Frank dug deeper into Strode's wardrobe. He found a secret passage in the cupboard which contained a backpack. The backpack contained several magazines reporting on Frank attending Sue and Olivia's funeral, as well as when Frank was still a lawyer. One of the news articles reported that he had succeeded in freeing the perpetrators of the murder of Strode's daughter. That afternoon, when Strode had returned home, he found a photograph tucked into the windshield of his car. On the back of the photo, Frank wrote a message asking Strode to meet him at Kingsman Station at 11:00 tonight. Their meeting place was an empty warehouse at the station. Strode got out of his car warily. But Frank had gone into hiding. He suddenly attacked Strode, and a moment later, a fight broke out.
Now you know why I did it, Frank.
Both of them have balanced martial arts skills. But at the end of the fight, Frank, who gets the chance to stab Strode, suddenly decides to let Strode live. Frank managed to overcome his lust for revenge.
The best revenge is to be unlike your enemy.
At the end of the film, Frank is seen exiting the courthouse, where he had just attended the trial of Strode, who had been convicted of his crimes. Afterwards, Frank, accompanied by Alma, visits the graves of Sue and Olivia. In front of the graves, Frank ended his vow not to speak, and the first words that came out of his mouth were, "I love you." If you enjoyed this video, don't be shy, hit the like button, and if you disliked it, hit the dislike button twice just to be sure. You should watch the full movie. Thank you very much for watching.